October 28, 1974. A mysterious man with a secret shows up in Austin, Texas.
2 Mormon missionaries go missing, and everyone sets their eyes on Robert. He seemed to be a really accomplished individual. Of course, that all turned out to be lies.
Down the street from his home, another kind of horror is being filmed.
The Texas Chainsaw Massacre is still, to this day, one of the most famous horror movies of all time.
Just 27 days after the Texas Chainsaw Massacre debuts in theaters, a real-life killing will rival Hollywood's best.
Some of the media stories up there talk about him as the Texas Chainsaw Massacre man.
But just when the case seems solved, there is a twist no one sees coming.
It seems that finally, justice will be served. But just like in the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, once again, the killer got away.
No, I'm not a killer.
Do you believe that you will not ever die in the electric chair?
I don't believe I will, no.
I think sociopaths think the world owes them a pass. I think Gleason was a sociopath.
"42-year-old Robert Gleason and horror icon Leatherface from the Texas Chainsaw Massacre have a common interest.
Robert was a taxidermist and hunter. He killed animals, cleaned them up, and made them look alive again.
Author Ken Driggs will never forget the real-life Texas Chainsaw Massacre.
I wrote a book about these murders and Bob Gleason's life. What do I think of when I think of Robert Gleason? I think of predators. I think that religion doesn't always draw religious seekers, it draws predators.
When it comes to Robert, it's not the dead animals the townsfolk are afraid of.
They're beginning to see this guy as a potential threat, a physical threat to people.
He sent police for nearly 30 years on a cat and mouse chase. He reinvented himself over and over and over again. It was like nothing anyone had ever seen.
As an adolescent, Robert Gleason has only one interest in mind.
He's an only child. His father was a hunter. There was a gun culture in the home.
From a very early age, Robert was taught to hunt and to use a gun. And that must have been very exciting for a boy of his age, because clearly, when you have a gun, you feel you have a certain sense of power and a way of protecting yourself.
There were a lot of guns in the home. They could have just been infatuated with guns.
Robert's parents are married for 19 years before he is born. Although he seems like an unlikely miracle, his childhood is filled with abuse.
Robert's father beat his mother, and he also beat Robert. Robert's father had a tremendously difficult temper and screamer, yeller, very threatening.
There was a lot of pressure on Robert.
In Robert's father's eyes, he was never good enough.
Sorry, Dad.
As the years go by, Robert also develops severe anger issues, just like his father.
He had a flash temper, and given his infatuation with guns, that flash temper got connected up to firearms. If there was a gun around, he was going to use it to try to control the situation or to draw attention to himself.
It's an attribute Robert's defense attorney, David Bays, has seen in his client.
As I understand it, he had been rabbit hunting and had stepped on a nail, and the nail had gone through the shoe and into his foot, and he went into an emergency room. They didn't get to him right away. They didn't treat him right away.
So he went back out to his vehicle, got a gun, came into the emergency room, pinned a nurse up against the wall, fired 5 times in the wall and ceiling around her until he was wrestled to the floor by other staff.
Robert is involuntarily committed to a mental institution and charged with first-degree felony assault.
They sent him to state hospital, and he spent a considerable amount of time there. And at some point, they dropped the charges because the doctors apparently were giving him favorable medical reports.
Almost 2 years after the shooting incident, Robert is released.
It's pretty much during this time in Robert's life that he reinvents his entire existence. He taught himself taxidermy, learning through a mail order course.
Robert moves back home and in with his mother, but trouble is never far away. Eventually, Robert's father has a complete breakdown and is committed to a mental institution. Now, Robert is the man of the house.
His mother comes into a large piece of farmland. It was an area where he could roam the countryside with a gun and shoot things. So I think that enabled that infatuation. Personally, I suspect he just liked the thrill of discharging firearms and the power they seem to represent for him over other people and things.
But for Robert, his passion for guns and boiling temper are a catastrophic collision. And when he confronts 2 men shooting frogs on his property, he loses his cool.
He orders them to give up their guns and to get off my property, to leave. As they're leaving, he decides they're not moving fast enough, and he shoots one of them in the foot, taking off the toes of one of the men when he shot him.
Robert is arrested for the shooting. While he sits in jail awaiting his hearing, investigators search his mother's house.
In the search of his mother's house, they find 126 rifles and shotguns, 4 submachine guns, 32 handguns, 42,000 rounds of ammunition, and several hand grenades, which you don't use hunting rabbits.
Robert now faces 38 counts of state weapons law violations.
He knows there's a possibility that he could go to jail for having all those weapons, but he doesn't want to take that chance. He's a risk taker. He's a schemer, and so he flees. He skips town and moves to Texas. You're dealing with someone who thinks they're above the law.
Outside of Austin, Texas, Robert moves into a home behind the local taxidermist and secures a part-time job.
He eventually settles at Lem Rathbone's taxidermy studio. It was a family business. Rathbone gives him keys and access to the taxidermy studio in exchange for him acting as a sort of a night watchman on the facility. That apparently involved some disposition of animal remains after the taxidermy work had been done.
I think he really felt as though he found his place. He was at home and he was happy.
Robert knows back in his home state of New York, he's still a wanted man with a criminal background. So he decides it's time to, once again, reinvent his past.
He starts telling people he's a former CIA agent.
I was sent by the CIA.
And had been a government assassin, that he had been involved with some attempts to assassinate Fidel Castro, that he was a spy plane pilot.
And my job was to shoot down the enemy airplane.
The story sort of evolved depending on the reception of the audience.
He did not want to be labeled as a person with a mental illness. That was more important than anything else to him. So he fought like a tiger when it came to establishing his bona fides.
Robert is desperate to find a group of people that will believe his lies. So he turns to the Mormon Church for fellowship.
I think the Mormon Church has a history and a tradition of being helpful to their membership. If someone has a tragedy in their life, they'll all pitch in and help out. And I think he saw that if he became a good Mormon, that they would help him.
Now you dwellers in Jerusalem and
He then presents himself to Mormon congregations in Austin as an investigator wanting to join. An investigator is the Mormon word for someone who's thinking maybe they want to become a Mormon.
Because of his interest, Mormon missionaries frequent Robert's house.
The missionaries were taken in and enthralled by Robert's story.
These are 18, 19, 20-year-old kids who don't have a lot of life experience. Probably were pretty vulnerable to thinking, oh, this is cool and exciting.
While Robert spins lies about his past in Texas, down the road from his new home, another story is being produced. The controversial horror movie, The Texas Chainsaw Massacre, is in production just one town over.
I would say that the Texas Chainsaw Massacre is one of the more iconic horror movies. It was very simple, yet there was something about it that just terrified a lot of audiences.
In The Texas Chainsaw Massacre, a character named Leatherface participates in his own version of taxidermy.
Leatherface and his family live in a small Texas town. Behind the doors of the farmhouse, the family has been dismembering people and using their body parts to make items around the house.
In the movie, Leatherface and his family hide in plain sight. Similarly, Robert's new neighbors are in the dark when it comes to his criminal past. But just like before, his violent urges won't stay buried for long. 1 year after moving to Texas, Robert's new life is upended when he is arrested for shooting buffalo without a permit and is sent to jail.
Robert felt that if he got arrested, that the Mormon church would be there to bail him out. And they did not.
Nobody would make his bond, and he felt like the Mormon church had abandoned him because they didn't visit him and fawn over him and, and make him the most important thing in their lives. And he was resentful of that. He sure was.
Robert makes a plea bargain and serves less than 6 months.
He just perseverates on how to get even with the Mormon church.
He's sending some very threatening letters. Letters talking about blood, and I'm not going to roll down and take anything. I'm going to fight like hell. They're going to regret this. They're pretty angry letters that include some threats of violence.
Over the next several months, Robert sends multiple letters to the church.
They got progressively worse because, of course, he's not taking any accountability, and he has these horrible anger issues, and he's just ruled by his impulses to get revenge, to get even.
In the movie The Texas Chainsaw Massacre, Leatherface is always ready to kill.
I think that when people think of the Texas Chainsaw Massacre today, they see a chainsaw-wielding maniac.
Off-screen, Robert is also a ticking time bomb.
The stage theory was that he sent their bodies out, chopped them up on this bandsaw in the taxidermist shop, and sent their bodies out with a rendering.
Robert Gleason is an angry man on the verge of creating his very own Texas Chainsaw Massacre.
Robert had a long list of run-ins with the law. From shooting a gun off in an emergency room to shooting off a man's toe. Robert had a reputation for being dangerous and also being a liar.
His latest infraction gets him arrested and put in jail. But it's the Mormon church that takes the brunt of Robert's anger.
In Robert's mind, he became furious because he felt that they should have come and bailed him out.
While Robert writes the church threatening letters, the 1974 theatrical release of the Texas Chainsaw Massacre is just as red hot.
The Texas Chainsaw Massacre grossed more than $30 million in the United States and Canada, making it the 12th highest grossing film in 1974.
But although the movie is a box office success, its disturbing content soon ignites a wave of controversy.
In England and several other countries, the film was initially banned due to its violence and content.
Resembling the movie's villain, Leatherface, Robert spends hours a day tearing apart flesh and working with the dead.
He spent his nights working at the taxidermy shop, and during the days, he spent his time telling the Mormon church how much he hated them.
I want blood.
But after several threatening letters, the church's local bishop has had enough.
Robert's hatred towards the church is so vile that church leaders see him as dangerous and warn members to stay their distance.
But two of the church's missionaries feel Robert is exactly the kind of person that needs to hear the word of God. 19-year-old Mark Fisher and 20-year-old Gary Darley feel like they have made a commitment to Robert and decide to continue seeing him in hopes of restoring him back to the church.
Faithful young Mormon, mostly boys, are assigned to a congregation. They see themselves as teachers and guides. They're interested in baptizing people. They're young, and they're usually pretty inexperienced in the world. I think they were also a bit fascinated, maybe a bit drawn in by Cleason.
They felt like it was their duty to preach to anyone, who was involved in the Mormon religion, and so he was just one of the people they had to take care of.
I know that we're doing a great thing, but
They have been seeing him on Monday nights from time to time. He would cook them game meals and tell them his stories.
But soon, the missionaries see that Robert has a dark side.
Were you talking about my letter? Do you even understand why I got those letters? Why I had to write them?
I believe the men started to feel uneasy because they saw how emotionally unbalanced Robert was.
Do you understand any of it? Were you listening to what I was just telling you? You don't understand any of it, do you?
How angry he was. How much he was into blame and revenge. Well, we know that Gary wrote in his journal that he was becoming uneasy about returning to see Robert. So we know that Gary felt that Robert was threatening and had the potential to be violent.
The men continue to visit Robert and preach their beliefs until they receive an ominous message from the church.
The bishop calls Darley and says, "You need to stop seeing this guy. I'm warning you, you need to stop seeing this guy."
27 days after the Texas Chainsaw Massacre debuts in theaters, Mark and Gary make what they have decided will be their last trip to visit Robert.
And Darley says, "We've made a commitment to him for Monday night, October 28th. We'll go out there and we'll tell him that we can't come back out and see him anymore."
They had promised Mr. Cleason they would be there for that meal, so they kept their promise.
Unfortunately for these Mormon missionaries, they were just too young and too inexperienced to realize what they were up against.
The missionaries don't know Robert is the real-life version of a Hollywood villain, Leatherface.
Leatherface got his name because he wears a mask made of human skin out of his victims.
In the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, a group of friends traveling the back roads of Texas have a deadly run-in with Leatherface.
The young people are driving through a small town in Texas when they run out of gas. The friends go looking for gas and stumble upon this house, which is ultimately where their horrors lie.
Now, 2 Mormon missionaries have come to tell Robert tonight is their last visit.
No doubt Gary and Mark felt uneasy when they told him they would not be returning for Monday night dinners.
We were ordered not to come and see you anymore.
They start talking, and yet again, Robert goes completely off the rails.
I invited you over to my home. I've been cooking for you and treating you like family, and now you're just gonna abandon me? Yeah, you better go. You better run out of here. You understand?
But Robert isn't going to let them leave that easily.
To Robert, here are 2 people who now are telling him, and we are not going to return because of you. And this to Robert, who prided himself on being superior to the human race. How can you reject me? You're not going to reject me.
In the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, you can hear Leatherface's chainsaw from a mile away. In real life, Robert gives no warning.
It appears that when the 2 young men tried to leave, Robert went after them as if he was hunting game. And he killed them.
Robert knows he has to hide his crimes in the event someone from the Mormon church comes looking for his victims.
I think the evidence is pretty clear that he cut some portion of them up on the bandsaw in the taxidermy studio. He used it to slice their heads up, which is a pretty grisly thought. He put the remains possibly in a bag, weighed them down with rocks, and throw them into a stream or a river somewhere.
When Mark and Gary don't return home, their friends and families grow concerned.
Nobody hears from them. They've got a rented apartment. Their landlord doesn't see them or hear from them. The last people to see them alive are a group of Mormons, and they see them driving off out to have dinner with Cleason that night.
A few days after the men go missing, the police show up on Robert's doorstep.
No one could really have known the full potential of how dangerous this man was. This was a real nightmare just waiting to happen.
Just weeks after the Texas Chainsaw Massacre is released, Robert Cleason kills 2 Mormon missionaries and dismembers them with a bandsaw.
Robert was furious with the Mormon church because he felt they had abandoned him when he needed them most.
And now, the police are at his home with a search warrant, looking for the missing Mormon missionaries. Like a scene straight from the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, the inside of Robert's home has traces of his victims. In the horror movie, the killer, Leatherface, has his work displayed all over his home.
Leatherface goes to graveyards to dig up bodies so that he can make things from the body parts.
His home looks like a haunted house.
He creates the back of a couch out of bones. There was a room full of feathers because he plucked chickens before dismembering them.
In the movie, everyone who enters his house is shocked by what they find. Likewise, as the police make their way around the property, Robert's secrets are revealed.
In the trailer, they find a big bag of watches, and one of them happens to be one of the missionaries with blood spatter on it. They find a key ring that has a key to the car that the missionaries were driving, a key to a bicycle that one of them rode, and a key to the apartment that they lived in.
Authorities also uncover several firearms Robert purchased illegally using multiple aliases. But it's outside Robert's house where authorities discover the most shocking evidence of his guilt.
Right outside of Robert's home, the police found one of the missionaries' ID badges. It had a bullet hole through it.
And in the taxidermy shop Robert works at, hair and blood are found on one of the saw blades.
There was also human biological material taken off the bandsaw that also they were able to match with the DNA of the two victims.
There had been a hearing in front of a justice of the peace that had established that the boys were dead, and there was a death certificate to that effect.
Some of the media stories up there talk about him as the Texas Chainsaw Massacre man.
I'm not a killer. I'm not a killer.
Robert is arrested and charged with the murders of missionaries Gary and Mark, but he maintains he is innocent and pleads not guilty.
There hadn't been a case in 40 years that approximated the interest that this case had. There was so much circumstantial evidence in this case that it's pretty clear that they met their end at his location. You almost had to listen to him because otherwise he would, you'd lose the continuity you had in the defense and make him mad, and there's no telling what he would do then. So it was something we just put up with.
And after a lengthy trial, Robert is found guilty of the missionaries' murders and sentenced to death. The instrument used to cover his crimes stands out most to the jury.
This thing stood about 6 feet high, and they positioned it right in front of the jury, and it stayed there for, I'm gonna say, 3 or 4 days during the trial. And every minute the jury could look there and imagine the bandsaw being used in this incident. It was something I would have done if I'd been prosecuting, I'll put it that way.
Do you believe that you will not ever die in the electric chair?
I don't believe I will, no.
Just 2 years later, a technicality almost sets him free. The search warrant police used to find the evidence at Robert's house is found to be defective. Prosecutors can retry the convicted killer, but the evidence found at his home will no longer be valid.
They were thinking about retrying it, but they didn't think they had the evidence to go forward.
Instead, Robert is taken off death row, and the murder charges are dropped.
When his conviction is reversed, it doesn't end his criminal trouble. He's got other stuff pending. He's still got this warrant from the case in New York where he's jumped bail. He's got a Federal Firearms Act charge in Texas.
For his past crimes, Robert is sentenced to 9 years in prison.
It's an amazing break for Robert. This is an individual who prided himself on breaking laws, who prided himself on getting away and getting over and manipulating the system.
While he's in prison, Robert joins a pen pal group and begins exchanging letters with a widow named Marie.
Marie lives in England. Her husband had died, and she was looking for companionship.
He's telling Marie he's a college professor and he's living at the prison while he teaches inmates.
She doesn't know who Robert is, and Robert is a habitual liar, a fabricator, someone who is there to manipulate, to get over, and to conquer.
I mean, that's typical Robert Gleason. You can't check out his facts, and he's very happy to provide you with, a whole new story.
As the two get to know each other, Marie opens up about her past.
Marie tells Robert that she owns a home in England and she came into a bit of money when her first husband died. For Robert, he wants to have a clean slate so he can leave and go to another country and reinvent himself, because that's what he's done his entire life.
Robert sees Marie as his ticket to a new life. So after he's served his time, he moves to England and starts over.
Robert was an individual who could kill and then go on with his life as if nothing had happened because he lacked any kind of empathy. He had no remorse. It was just all about him.
In the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, Leatherface and his family get away with murder time and time again.
It is a pretty classic Hollywood horror movie in that no matter how fast these characters are, they just don't seem to be able to escape the family or Leatherface.
Robert also seems to be above the law.
He moved in with Marie, and he begins to reinvent himself once again.
I think he targets vulnerable people. I think that made them less adept at seeing him for what he was, for seeing through his stories as false.
But behind Robert's calculated smile is a deadly villain. And like Leatherface in the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, there's no telling when he might strike again.
Everyone in Robert's life was in danger. The problem is they just don't know it yet.
Robert Gleason is a killer on the loose, hiding behind a mask. Similar to his movie counterpart, Leatherface.
His new friends have no idea about his criminal past, especially not that he was once a convicted murderer.
No one really knew Robert. Even those who were close to him thought he was something he wasn't.
Yanked off death row on a technicality, Robert flees to England and moves in with his pen pal girlfriend, Marie.
His new friends, they're seeing a new person, an American, who tells them that he was in the war and was a war hero. He really just is a cold-hearted killer.
Comparable to Leatherface in the cult classic horror film The Texas Chainsaw Massacre, Robert is a monster looking to prey on the innocent.
Leatherface wears a mask made out of dried human skin, stitched together. It's dried like leather, and that gives him a really creepy look.
Although Robert's mask isn't tangible, the lies he uses to hide his past covers up his true identity.
You're looking at a master manipulator, an expert liar, and a person who has a compulsion to lie.
Robert proposes to Marie, and she accepts his hand in marriage. But their new life is built on a house of lies.
In their wedding picture, he is wearing something around his neck that he claims is the Congressional Medal of Honor, and a panel of ribbons across his pocket that he claims are other military and intelligence service medals.
But what starts off as another new beginning soon takes a wicked turn.
After Robert and Marie get married, the honeymoon period's over, and the true Robert comes out again. And again, he starts to stockpile guns. So he returns to that same habit of gun collecting.
I don't know that a gun ever came into his possession that he let out of his possession. I think he just stacked them up.
Can I get you anything?
Nope.
Robert has a short fuse with Marie.
Marie.
Clean it up now.
Now!
He grows physically abusive towards Marie. It must have been a shock to her because she knew nothing of his personality. He had presented this entirely different person, this charming, loving, doting husband to be.
In the film, The Texas Chainsaw Massacre, Leatherface imprisons his victims in his home before slaughtering them.
Leatherface tortures people by making them observe how he's mutilating someone or how he's mutilating them.
Although sometimes his victims are able to break free and escape, Leatherface always seems to have a way of dragging them back home.
They think that they have a chance to survive, but he always seems to know exactly where they're gonna go, and he's incredibly fast, and he's everywhere.
In England, Marie is terrified of her new husband and feels like a prisoner in her own home.
At one point, he beat her and wouldn't let her go to the hospital. When she threatened to leave him, he said, "If you leave me, I will hunt you down and I will kill you."
For the next 8 years, Marie keeps her abusive relationship with Robert hidden from family and friends. But soon, those close to Robert begin to notice something isn't quite right.
Robert's a member of a local gun club, and the members of the gun club start to call him Odd Bob.
Odd Bob, because of his odd behavior and all the stories that he told that they increasingly were unwilling to believe.
One of the club's members, Tony Fox, has a strange feeling about Robert and his so-called heroic past.
Tony remembers Robert wearing the Medal of Honor, so he decides to investigate a little. He wants to look into this.
Tony contacts the Congressional Medal of Honor Society in the United States, asking about Robert's medal.
He's the one who first ran down the organization that keeps track of Congressional Medals of Honor recipients, and they'd never heard of Bob Gleason.
Tony is anything but surprised that Odd Bob is not who he says he is.
Over time, people start to see through the lies. They start to see a man who is emotionally unbalanced. They don't see what he wants them to see.
Tony goes to the police with his findings, and they agree to look into Robert Gleason's background. But what they uncover will put into motion a series of events pulled straight from a real-life horror movie.
In the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, people understand that there is something off about the family, but no one would have any idea just how wrong things were until they set foot in that house.
For Robert, his house of lies that he's constructed is beginning to crumble. And there's no telling what he's going to do when his lies are all found out.
Robert Gleason is a Texas Chainsaw-like killer trying to outrun his past. But this time, there is nowhere to hide.
Robert murdered 2 young men back in America. He was released from jail on a technicality. He started his life over in England, telling people he was a war hero and an ex-CIA agent.
In England, Robert marries his pen pal, Marie, but wedded bliss doesn't bless the couple for long. The police open an investigation into Robert's background and uncover his sordid past.
They found out he had a death sentence in the state of Texas, and that he had been a prison inmate in New York, and that he'd been a prisoner in the federal correction system in the United States.
When Robert applied for a gun license in England, he failed to report his past convictions, which means his license to carry firearms has never been legal. So local authorities search his home and turn up more than they ever anticipated.
When the police came and took away his guns, Robert reacted as if they had taken away his children. He cried. He was upset. That shows you what he is most strongly connected to. Not humans, not people, but those guns and that need to protect
Those
himself.
are my guns. I bought those legally. I have a permit. Where does he take them?
They confiscated over 40 weapons, including a Thompson submachine gun and a large cache of ammunition.
The raid on Robert's house sends him over the edge. While he waits to see if the police will charge him for illegally owning the weapons, Robert goes on a rampage.
He's furious that his weapons were taken away, and of course, what does he do with that anger? He wants revenge.
In the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, only one of the friends that ventures into Leatherface's house is still alive at the end of the movie.
Sally wakes up at the dinner table with Leatherface and his family. Sally's finger is cut and the blood is fed to the grandpa, and then they continue to torture her.
Sally tries to break free from her captors, but no matter what she does, they are determined to kill. Robert's wife, Marie, has also been trapped in her own home.
Robert makes it clear to Marie, if she ever tries to leave him, he'll kill her.
But after years of abuse, she is ready to escape.
Marie goes to a friend's house and she hides there from Robert. He's no idea where she is.
While Marie seeks shelter, police return to Robert's house and conduct a second search.
This time, they found 2 more pistols that he had hidden. One of these is an assassin's pistol with a silencer. That's illegal and he can't have it.
Robert is arrested for possession of an illegal firearm and sentenced to 3 years in prison. In the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, Sally is able to make a run for it and escape from Leatherface and his family.
Sally's so determined that she not only breaks free once, but she breaks free twice. Sally makes it out to a road where she is eventually able to escape Leatherface when she meets a motorist, and we're led to believe that he takes her to safety.
Marie, too, is able to escape Robert's evil domain. Although Leatherface isn't captured, in real life, Robert finally faces the ultimate punishment. While he is serving his time in an English prison, DNA evidence is found in the case of the 2 murdered missionaries from Texas.
DNA science had moved along to the point where they were able to get DNA evidence off of some of his clothing that had been seized at the site. It was smeared in blood that turned out to be the blood of one of the victims.
He was still in jail, and there was a request to extradite him, but he had a heart attack and passed away while they were trying to get him back.
In the movies, Leatherface is immortal.
Leatherface comes back time and time again, whether it's through revivals or spin-offs that they do, and each time he's bigger, badder, and more deadly.
But in real life, Robert is not so lucky.
This was a true sociopath, a real-life monster. And who knows what would have happened had he lived.